Welcome everyone, my name is Mark,
I'm Greg.
and this is Gaming Mechanics,
Episode Uno.
a podcast seeking to explore the unexplored topics of games, how they work, and why we love them.
All of those things we do. We're two friends. Actually, we've been kind of gaming for our whole lives and thinking about it, talking about it. In fact, this is something, the reason we're doing this in large part is because we do this on a semi-weekly basis anyway, of just getting together, talking. And it usually goes to gaming as an idea in some sense. It's actually the way we've kind of kept our friendship up. Mark moved across the country 2 years ago now, and we've been keeping up by playing and talking remotely. So we figured we'd just kind of organize some of our thoughts because we have a lot of them. Put them down, see if anyone else thinks about them or would be interested to hear them. So that is the idea here. And for starters, we're going to go into the title of this particular podcast with the idea of metas in gaming.
Yep, so we're going to talk about sort of the part of the game that really emerges out of player dynamics for the most part. The concept of metas is pretty common in, for example, the Overwatch scene, a game like Super Smash Brothers or any sort of a fighting game. Pretty much anything with a competitive scene. What happens is players develop sound strategies for a particular opponent or maybe for all opponents that is particularly effective, and that is sometimes referred to as the current meta of the game, just that way, that strategy of playing, and then that way may later on be overtaken by some other strategy. And so you have this constant evolving of the dominant strategy and the effective way to play certain characters, or even an effective way to look at the game,
Right.
think certain things to optimize or care about that are particularly important.
Right, and even past that, it's interesting you're using the word strategy a lot, which is totally appropriate for what kind of the meta is in a game. But it's also interesting just in terms of the difference between tactics and strategy, right, within a game, where tactics generally will stay pretty straightforward through a game. Tactics kind of refer to like the moment-to-moment idea of what you do in a game. So, in Overwatch, being able to simultaneously cast multiple ults or combine ultimate abilities well, flanking, not taking fights that you shouldn't be, all that jazz. That stuff stays pretty consistent across games. So that's slightly different from strategy, right? Which is the
Right.
idea that how you're actually going to be approaching the game itself in a competitive sense, and what strategies, what long-term patterns basically you're going to be using to try to be winning. And those do shift over time.
That's a good distinction.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's a good distinction that you point out. And I think that metas typically have more influence on long-term strategy.
Right, yeah. Sometimes if something changes enough, then, yeah, exactly. Then you'll end up having to adjust the way you do things kind of game to game. But in the larger sense, the meta is far more strategic, the way kind of what's decided before the game starts. Tactics kind of change within the game as you adjust to what's happening in real time. Strategy tends to be pretty well defined beforehand, and that both of those things are to varying levels are self-contained. They affect one another, but they also can play off each other.
Well, metas are popular in pretty much any, like I said, any competitive game, and of course Overwatch lends itself well to this sort of a dynamic. Greg, you might be a little bit more qualified to speak about what are sort of the current evolutions happening in the Overwatch meta?
Sure. Well, I love
this as an example.
That's the reason that outside of just playing games are fun, but the getting to think about games in a larger sense and why things happen the way they do is particularly with a community of people. It is kind of this weird everyone's trying to solve the game, right? They're trying to find the most effective way to play a game at any point in time, and distinguish the kind of objectively best way to gain victory. So with Overwatch, we've seen a number of metas. I mean, from the very beginning, you had that was a game that I kept up with and watched a lot of, particularly both kind of casual streamers on Twitch as well as the early competitive scene. So this actually segues well into the next point, which is just kind of the different ways that metas develop, both very kind of emergently and organically from the players themselves, or with a lot of developer support slash patching a game, altering the game and the different mechanics in it. And so Overwatch has had both of those things. Initially, actually, the very beginning, if anyone's played Overwatch, a big part of the game is character switching. And initially in the competitive scene, both professionally and even just the competitive ranked game mode, you could have multiple multiple of the same character on the same team. So you could actually field an entire team of 6 Tracers or 6 Winstons.
Mm-hmm.
And any combination or permutation therein of those characters, and that became that was actually this is a really interesting discussion actually in terms of the way that basically eventually they decided to axe that and have ranked play be you could only ever have one character of the same type on a team, and you could have multiple of a character between the 2 teams. You could both field a Tracer, but you can only have one of each.
Well, if I remember correctly, there was some pretty breaking strategies,
highly.
right? With when you could have 6 of the same character.
Yeah, exactly. And the interesting thing was that the original intent of the designers was to have Overwatch be a game where you were very hero switching. They wanted to be a very main mechanic where you weren't just playing the same hero the entire game, hopefully. And so to that end, they were like, yeah, everyone can play any hero at any point, and so the switching can be one of the strategic elements. The thing that happened though was that basically trying to control for it's kind of the combination permutation thing, right? Like if you don't have a discrete amount of the number of variables just skyrocketed because you could have so many possible combinations or permutations rather of the different characters, because they launched with 22 I think at launch. So do the math there, but so there were just these incredibly what it actually did was it made a very 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 small strategic kind of window for the game where these are the things that were able to work because there were so many different ways that you could do it. Some of them were just massively overpowered and became very, very difficult to balance around it. So, in fact, something that was attempting to make a much broader range of strategic depth tended to pigeonhole people and to only be able to play a few different compositions of heroes to actually make it work. And as a whole, the developers...
I think it's a good point that you bring up, too, about, like, it's an interesting case study when there are so many permutations and so many ways to potentially play a game. There's almost like an obviousness factor that can cause a meta to stick around for a really long time, or that even prompts developers to need to step in and to mix it up a little bit because so many people are flocking toward one particular dominant strategy.
Which is interesting that you bring that up too, because obviously there's you're far more qualified to talk about this than me. So if you could talk about the fact that I was talking about, there's tons of those permutations with Overwatch with 20 characters. But then we go to something like Super Smash Bros. Melee, which has one of the best thriving and long-term communities I think existing right now in gaming. That had absolutely how about you talk about how the Smash meta has changed, because there's tons of permutations, but both with matchups as well as maps in Smash, and we ran into we didn't run into that problem with Smash, right?
No, yeah, not at all. And I think you actually could argue that you don't run into it anywhere. Once you overcome that obviousness factor,
yeah.
I mean, I suppose that sometimes people could really be overpowered and there's really no way to beat a specific strategy, in which case, the developers have got to do something. But what we saw in Smash was... well, he's a pretty dominant character, but Melee definitely had its rise and falls of characters who seemed to be godlike, and what we saw is over 10 plus years, the meta evolved pretty handsomely. I mean, there was characters who initially they were thought to be very very good, and then they fell to about mid-level, about 7 or 8 years in, and that was a combination of people figuring out new ways to play maybe these lesser characters, these supposedly weaker characters, or just new exploits, new ways of being able to predict moves from a specific character. I mean, even if you think about from the human standpoint, if there is really one particular way to play a character, being able to predict that is a massive advantage when facing them, because the element of surprise is totally gone.
Yeah.
So if there's really if a character actually pigeonholes himself too much into a particular meta, there almost becomes like a meta where it's like you have so much. It's true that it's a good strategy, but you also lose any element of surprise because your opponent knows exactly what you're going to do.
Yeah, no, precisely. That makes tons of sense, and especially, I mean, that's the weird, like, for a guy like me who comes from my background, particularly in terms of competitive stuff, was RTS gaming, back in the early 2000s and mid early 2000s, and RTSs are pretty notable for, well, minus at least in that time period, being having a whole lot of developer influence in terms of meta of the competitive scene, just due to patching. Patch cycles tended to, depending on the game, right? Sometimes patch cycles would be within every month. That would be a decently quick one, but balance patches would be coming within a month. And today, even if you look at StarCraft 2 or some of the MOBAs, which are, derivatives of RTSs, those tend to get balance patches within probably every couple weeks. And so the idea, I remember when you first told me about the fact that there had literally been no patching done to Smash over its entire lifespan, and that
Hmm.
I remember there's a really actually cool chart that you showed me, right? It's just a graphical representation of I forget if it was win rates or picks in competitive Smash, but basically they just showed a graphical representation of how much different characters got used, and it was over the whole lifespan, and it
Yeah.
was like, I mean, it looks like someone had been doing it intentionally to balance out different heroes. I mean, you literally saw people go from the top three down to like bottom mid, and other people that had been, stagnant for
Hmm.
years. Suddenly, someone unlocked some hidden potential in it and suddenly became like a top 10 character, which is that's insane.
Yeah, yeah, like yeah, Mario, was in the top five and fell down to like not
Right,
even
right,
in the
right.
top 10 after the 12 years that the chart covered. But it was crazy to see how much, with no interference from the developers, the players just thinking through how to use the characters, varied the
Yeah.
game so
Yeah,
much.
for sure. And I think that's, I mean, so that's obviously like when people talk about, there's in gaming communities, there tends to be, a whole lot of discussion. Balance tends to be one of the favorite things people talk about and whine about and gripe about. This is OP. This is like this is underpowered, whatever. But Smash at least is a fantastic. And of course, there's reasons that, Smash is a different game and it's a different style than other games, but even amongst the fighting genre, as far as I know, there's a decent amount of developer balancing that happens, and Melee is a unbelievably fantastic case study in the fact that, no, there's one thing a lot of people talk about is when a new patch gets released, it tends to be things that are overpowered, right? Just initially, because things got changed and people haven't adjusted to the new way to play the game, and people complain and yell and say this is a horrible change. And usually, what veteran gamers or more reasonable people tend to say is, give it some time to shake out, and that usually looks like a few weeks, right?
Right.
And as opposed to the span of like giving an entire game time to shake out over like a decade. Of course, not every game's going to have that longevity, but like just the fact that we have one very clear case study of the fact that, like, no, if you let a game sit, then it's not necessarily going to stagnate. If you have enough people playing it, and enough creative people playing it, then the possibilities are seemingly endless. Actually,
Yeah, and I mean, there's actually data from this Smash source where Zelda. Everybody thought Zelda was great for the first about 3 months of the game, and then Zelda fell real
wow,
hard.
yeah, it's
Um,
funny. Yeah, Zelda's like not
yeah,
used at all
not
anymore.
not a good character, at least not considered in about rank 20, and pretty much
Sure,
stayed there after
yeah,
starting at like rank 7. And
right.
people just realize it's funny that you say even like 2 weeks, and really there's so much that can happen in the first month or 2 months of a patch where players
Sure,
can realize that
sure.
something that seems really obviously good,
Mm,
if you play more subtly and with some more nuance, it's not actually
right.
much of an advantage.
Yeah, no, and that makes some sense. The majority of probably people's, understandings and adaptation will probably happen in the first, few weeks, month or so. But then even that, like, say, like, 95% of that happens in those months, then the last 5% gets spread out over maybe another 6 months or whatever. That last 5% can still be like highly game changing, like, like we've seen with Smith. How many characters are there in Melee? Do you know? I
In
mean,
Melee,
I can
there's
look this up too,
26.
but there's 20. How many?
26.
26. Yeah, see, that's a large cast of characters. Almost, very similar to where Overwatch is right now. Overwatch is at 24, I think.
Right.
Um,
And now you don't
so
have the team aspect because all of this is from
that's true.
one-on-one fights.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah. That
it
is
it
very
does
different.
provide like
Important
enough
distinction.
variability that you can play with things and see different matchups. I mean, with
Right.
26 characters, There's a ton of different matchups that you can do.
Oh yeah, what is that? 26 factorial for?
It's not. I wasn't
No,
going to try to do the math. It's
okay.
26
That's all right. We
choose
don't have to
2.
do it.
Uh,
Yeah. Which is we'll embarrass ourselves privately as we try to figure that out rather than broadcasting it. But I mean, so that brings me to the next
325.
325. Okay, yeah. So that's a lot of distinct matchups, right? So that brings me to like another and again, this is all very very often through the window of kind of this more RTS strategy game mindset, but just the idea of balancing to me is really interesting, right? Because you have um, this kind of push and pull consistently as a game designer, a developer of uniqueness versus pure balance, right? Like it's sometimes quipped online that one of the most balanced games in the world in terms of skill is chess, right? You the two sides in chess are completely identical except for the fact that white moves first, which isn't necessarily even an advantage. It just means black and white will have to play differently, and
Right.
and
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 somebody has
that
to
that
move
draws out.
first. I mean, just by the design.
But exactly within that game design, that is entirely necessary because it's turn based. But the two sides are completely identical. They have the exact same setup. They have the exact same pieces. It's 100% the same. And when you look at RTS games, in particular, you that tends to. I don't think any major esport RTS has ever been just one sided, basically, where you have to play against where there's no faction based gameplay. So
Mm-hmm.
the general just there being, hey, you want everyone to feel unique. I mean, the classic one would be StarCraft with Terran, Zerg, and Protoss, where each one of those three should feel like they play differently, and there should be some sort of fantasy with the class or the faction that you're playing, and it feels good to it feels unique and kind of distinct from the other ones, but is also totally equal in the way that you play against other people, and that's an unbelievably difficult um, dynamic to manage because the more dynamics or mechanics that you give to one faction or one group that's unique, the harder that it's. You're not comparing apples to apples anymore. You're comparing apples to oranges and trying to draw something that's qualitatively different qualitatively different and trying to make it quantifiably the same in terms of relevance.
Right.
That's
Similar.
super, super difficult. So you'd see this kind of push and pull across game balancing in general that becomes there's different people have different ideas about it in terms of which one you should kind of fall towards more so. Um,
I think while you were talking, I thought of Planetary Annihilation, which we played together for a
oh
bit,
yeah,
and
sure, yeah,
there's really only one faction in that
right,
game,
yeah, exactly. That's a one
and
faction game, isn't it?
right, and so for that reason, it's pretty balanced in terms of what your team can do. Now you can
Right,
talk about balance in terms of spawn points and things like that, but symmetrical maps for the most part take
right,
care of that. So it
right.
tends to be pretty easily balanced, I think. As a
Yeah,
game, it might not be balanced. That is to say, a specific unit might be extremely good, but anybody
right.
has as much access to that unit as anybody else.
Exactly. Yeah, across the board. Dox rushing right was always good for a really long time, but everyone could do that, and then that was that. So even there, that's an interesting like distinction, right? That if everyone has access to the same exact stuff, and someone finds one really 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 good strategy, then everyone's doing that strategy, and so whoever does it better wins. And that's not a strategy game anymore. That's just who can execute a build better.
Right,
It's less
yeah.
like
So
being able to.
there's an execution component to it of
Sure.
uh, and that's I mean that's an interesting point you bring up. Would you say that you said it isn't a strategy game at that point? It almost becomes something else. It becomes
Sure.
um, what would you say that it becomes more like if not a strategy game?
I mean, it's
More like
it's
the
something.
equivalent of like Egyptian rat screw
Yeah,
of
right. I
like
mean,
in a video game.
kind of it's more the equivalent of something like really really organized Sim City, where you both have to. It's kind of the self-contained thing that doesn't really rely too much on the other person at all. It's really just whoever can do this one thing better. There's no actually interaction or counterplay. It's just whoever executes this one thing better. So I guess it's more like like a standalone. I don't know, like an art competition, right? Well, okay, that's actually a bad example because art's super subjective, but some semblance of like whoever can baking competition, right? You can make the best chocolate chip cookies. Like there's no interaction between you and the other people. It's just whoever actually pulls off this recipe the best is going to win. And I
Right.
know that's also not exactly how baking works either, but bear with me. That's as close as we're gonna get. So I think it becomes something more like a simultaneous single player game that then one person gets to be better at, you know. Um, as
Right.
opposed to again like going back to the
There's
chess metaphor.
there's going to be some amount of player interaction for most of these things. I mean, sometimes there's a strategy where you build one particular mine, some sort of factory that produces resources, and you just build like 1,000 of them, and then you swamp your opponent. But
Right, right, right.
for example, the dox rushing analogy, like there very definitely was tactics and very like small map awareness things that you had to
Yeah,
be
sure.
good at in order to pull off the dox strategy better than your opponent.
Yeah,
But
that's
in
true.
terms of the overall thrust of what you were doing in a game, you and your opponent had the same idea.
Right,
You were going to start off by making a bunch of doxes and harassing their metal.
right,
Um, and
exactly. And that was
I think as a developer, there's an interesting tension between um, how much do we let it be about the tactics? And like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
everybody's doing the same thing, but there's an execution piece to it. I mean, some games like Guitar Hero, it's just execution. There's no
Right, exactly.
strategy for Guitar Hero. It's just how
Yeah,
good are you at pressing the buttons.
right.
And then in other games like chess, you could argue there's tactics and strategies in chess, but
Yeah,
you can't be better or worse at moving a chess piece. Like you move
right,
the
right. Yeah,
piece.
to getting exactly from
The strategy.
literally once you understand how the pieces move, if you're able to do that, then yeah. And that was something I actually ran into, like particularly if we're talking about back to the RTS slant, Brood War versus StarCraft Two, which are StarCraft Brood War was arguably kind of what launched the esport genre into something that was true professional scene, right? Where you had professional players who were on team. I remember trying to explain this to people in the early 2000s that in Korea, that StarCraft was like people would watch it in the same way we would watch like the NBA. Which
Hmm.
was mind numbing to people back then, and now is less so because esports are kind of blown up. But Brood War was kind of one of the first ones, if not kind of the first true one. And then of course they released a sequel. Blizzard Entertainment did StarCraft 2 in 2011, I think, and a couple expansions, and had a big competitive scene there. And it was nowhere near the same level as what Brood War achieved. And a lot of people talked about this is going to kind of, and we can kind of take a slightly right turn here, but this is something kind of that Mark and I have discussed multiple times, which is emergent gameplay, which refers to you want to just intro that idea for a sec, Mark, and then I can continue talking about my thing.
Yeah, yeah. So emergent gameplay is something that players discover while playing the game using mechanics that the developers intended usually, but just in a way that the developers didn't intend. A great example of this is wave dashing in Melee, where obviously directional air dodges were built into the game, but the developers didn't think of how you could rapidly directional air dodge onto the ground and thereby make your character move much faster.
Right.
Another example of this would be there's animation canceling buttons and key presses you can do in I think Halo 1 and 2, where you can shoot and then switch guns and switch back and actually skip the
Sure.
reload animation
Right, right, and that's
particular
actually
guns
yeah.
faster than you could be able to.
Right. Then normally just reloading. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
And
think that's a
so
Counter Strike
it
thing too.
becomes a very important part of the game, but it wasn't intended by the developers.
Exactly, exactly, and that's exactly what it's one of those things where, especially if you're watching competitive games and don't know anything about them, and you see these players doing these bizarre things that don't seem to have a reason, that's probably comes from some level of emergent, right? Like it was found out as the competitive scene was trying to, like I said, solve the game or try to find the best ways to play, and they stumbled across these ways to use mechanics that actually are superior to the maybe original mechanics that were being used. Anyway, the point is with StarCraft, I think an interesting one is that Brood War was made in released in '98, I think, or at least
Yeah, I
StarCraft
think
One
that's
was,
right.
and then maybe Brood War was '99. Super early again, games weren't a competitive thing, and the game itself was not hugely polished by today's standards. There were tons of different. And I think, sorry, I'm kind of over, but I think this is kind of true for Melee versus even Brawlers or Smash 4 as well. That the reason Melee was uh, so popular and was played so much, even over its sequels, similar to Brood War and StarCraft Two, was that there were all these little things that you could do that added nuance and strategy and then kind of acumen, like professional acumen to the game that were really difficult to do, that the designers fixed, quote unquote, fixed in the subsequent releases. So StarCraft 2 is the same thing,
Right.
where in Brood War, some of these emergent gameplay types would have been like, oh boy, like Scourge micro, right? Where if someone launches a suicide unit, basically a living missile at someone, you could, the way you controlled your units as it was tracking you, you could basically juke it out. You could trick the AI into think you were going one way, and in fact you were going the other. So in professional play, it's very, very fun to watch people utilize these really kind of cool little glitches. Almost glitches isn't quite the right word, but taking advantage of game systems that weren't perfectly coded, and being able to
Right.
add this new dynamic, or even span clicking. When you see professionals play RTSs, and they instead of kind of precisely clicking exactly what they need to, they click like hundreds of times. And that was a similar thing, which was it was a game mechanic where if you spawn clicked multiple times, where you're trying to go, that would interact with, I forget the exact interaction, but it would interact with the code in StarCraft and make your units. Oh, that's right. It would override pathing. Basically, there's some really bad pathing design, which refers to the way that when you tell a unit to go one place, they have to figure out how to get there. And if you tell a big group of units to get there, then all of their paths are kind of intersecting, and then the game has to figure out how to make them all get to the same place without interacting with each other. And the pathing in StarCraft wasn't that good, actually, because like I said, it was 20 years ago. And basically, if you set tons of orders to a group of units, then you could actually kind of override some of the initial pathing and glitch it into pathing better, actually, than it would have otherwise if you just clicked once. And because of
Interesting. I
that,
didn't know that. I was wondering
yeah, that's where that came from.
this clicking
Yeah.
was so.
Yep, yeah. That started in StarCraft. I get a lot of my game design. Like, I wouldn't have known that other than Sean Plott, Day Nine, is a commentator and game designer who is one of my favorites, and he was a StarCraft professional and would talk a lot about this sort of thing. So that's where I got that one. But in any case, basically StarCraft 2 had way better pathing, and you didn't have to do that anymore. And that actually eliminated a whole really fun and very watchable dynamic of the game, which was observing these people doing incredibly intense and impressive kind of manual dynamics, that no longer need to happen. And
Right.
what it eventually kind of turned into was something far more akin to uh, kind of what we were talking about, something closer to kind of this stagnant, if you do this thing better than the other person, which is just kind of these build orders, get a bigger death ball, get the correct amount of units, and then you just win the game, as opposed to all these really nice, subtle kind of strategic, or tactical choices you could make in the original StarCraft that were so much fun to watch. And even if everyone had like these, equal armies, then whoever handled them better, whoever microed them better, who was able to utilize more of these kind of glitchy emergent gameplay mechanics better would win. And you don't see that as much in
And
StarCraft
I don't
2.
think you see it as much in modern games in general. I mean, I think
Yeah,
actually
exactly.
as the level of perfection, quote unquote, goes up between games, you get less of this sort of fun management of the game's imperfections in a way that
Yeah.
becomes sort of a strategy of its own.
hmm Yeah, and it becomes kind of like something the community can latch onto, right? Too, like, it kind of gives some community ownership of the game, feeling like they, it's now more personal. It's something that they were able to be a part of and help develop, right? It gives them some skin in the game as opposed to just something very separate, where the developers are able to give you this thing, and then you kind of work around them, then they change it, and then you have to work around that. I wonder if it kind of helped give the community a sense of being able to be, active, in the way the game works.
I think part of what we're hitting at here is the idea of a skill cap, right? Like the idea
Sure.
that
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
so many different
Yeah.
things about the game to learn, and you could spend a lot of time just trying to practice macro strategy in StarCraft and get really good at what units to build in response to other factions.
Mhm.
And not really spent much time at all on these little micro tactics, and
Mhm.
you still might get obliterated because it's an important part of the game.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I remember, and this was early on in StarCraft 2's life cycle, and uh, it's just kind of the epitome of that. StarCraft 2 has since, I think, changed a lot. The developers have recognized some of these things, and hence tried to kind of rebuild parts of the game to allow some of it to happen more organically. But I remember Sean Day Nine Plot was talking. He was commentating. Like I said, he was a Brood War player, a professional player, and then transitioned more into casting and announcing for StarCraft 2. I remember it was very early in StarCraft 2's life cycle, but he was casting. It wasn't a professional match, but he was doing a replay, and he was casting two really good characters, or two good players, and was watching the end game here, where one character just basically rolled over the other one player, and was like, yeah, finesse and Brood War, kill shit in StarCraft 2. Like that kind of just summed up
Hmm.
the essence of the difference there. And of course, that's oversimplified. There's finesse to be had, but yeah, I think there is some level of having kind of had a more of a culture of developer, and which isn't necessarily a bad thing, of developers, trying to make sure their game's super polished. Um, but that I think it
How
takes a
would
toll
you?
on
I
the
mean,
singer.
what way would you think the developers could try to build something like that into their
Right. What's the
game
answer?
now? Because I think forced imperfection is a little weird,
Yeah.
and it just kind of feels like they almost like they didn't care about some aspect of
Sure.
the game, or
Sure.
it can feel like that to the players. But we see that it actually does leave room for a community to take ownership, to learn the quirks. There is a high skill cap, so you can invest a lot of time in becoming good at it
Right.
instead of pulling up this iteration of modern warfare or whatever Battlefield's doing now,
Mm-hmm.
and it's essentially the same, very well polished. It runs exactly identically to the previous game,
Sure.
and there aren't a lot of ways to kind of make it your own.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a good point, right? Like, what's it's nice and easy to sit back and kind of criticize, but then what's the solution? Like, is the solution to make games
Right.
less polished? Then everyone would flip shit and get angry about that too. Um,
Exactly.
so yeah, no, that's a great question. That's probably why we're not game developers, Mark. If we knew the answer to that,
Fair
maybe
enough.
we should give up our day jobs. But no, I mean, I think like I said with the StarCraft 2 example, over the lifespan of that game, the developers, I think, were recognizing some of those more systemic problems with the game, which was kind of like, hey, whoever builds a bigger death ball, regardless of unit composition, is going to win. It was kind of this race to seeing who could get max food cap, build the most units, and then
Right.
roll over the other team. And I think, I don't know. I mean, I would say there's some level of intentional being able, like, intentional design where you're still replicating some of the results of those little gameplay glitches, right? Like, but actually doing it intentionally. So designing a new unit, right? Like for StarCraft, they were able to release multiple expansions, and they were able to add new units into the game and say, hey, we see this thing from Brood War that was super fun and people were able to latch onto. I don't have any specific examples, but as an idea, say, hey, these are the sort of things that seem to be most engaging for the players, and let's see if we can actually build something for them that will replicate that dynamic, but in an intentional way, not in a, hey, you guys will have to discover this, which does lose out on some
Hmm.
of those benefits, like we are talking about. Maybe the engagement of players and kind of identifying with the game itself, but you're still at least giving them the same gameplay
Yeah.
mechanic or dynamic that was so engaging in the first place, and that maybe that's the best you can do. I don't know.
Yeah, I do think you're right that there wouldn't be the same sense of like we're discovering something in the game, but I do think that there is a way to build in kind of like tools, like
Mm-hmm.
you're saying. Like I'm reminded of Oriana in League of Legends. She's got this
Mm-hmm.
ball that she can command to go different places and do
Yeah.
different things,
Yeah.
and they now some of the character design hints at how best to do that,
Mm-hmm.
but that to me is an example of we kind of put this thing in the game. We didn't tell you exactly how it's supposed to work. Ness from Super Smash Brothers
Mm-hmm.
has got a couple things like this too, where he's got his little telekinetic lightning ball that he can
Sure.
send around, and he also can hit himself with it, and he actually can also use it to boost himself up onto the
Right.
edge, and
There's a
it's a really
recovery
powerful
option.
attack. And there's actually lots of ways to use this one particular facet of the character, and I think maybe having more tools like that, where okay, this does something,
Yeah.
but we're not going to tell you,
Yeah.
or we're not going to make it obvious exactly the best way to use this. You've got to figure that out. I think that can be really interesting for players.
No, precisely. Yeah, I think the name for that is like lateral game design, right? The idea of building tons of space into You know, like having, as opposed to, hey, this ability will do this, use it this way and only this way, and then this will be fun, that sort of thing. Sometimes that's necessary, but I think what you're talking about is like, yeah, having ability or a dynamic or mechanic put into the game that has a lot of space to be explored, right? Giving that space for that emergent gameplay to come out, which again is that's got to be an incredibly difficult thing as a developer to try to figure out the line between, hey, are we just kind of throwing something in, or are we actually giving space for players to be creative with this mechanic? I think that's kind of the gold standard. There would be trying to find a mechanic that gives the players a whole lot of freedom to be able to use in different ways, as opposed to just having
Mm-hmm.
a single way to do it. And that's, I mean, so that actually, we're getting kind of close to time here. I think that could transition well into next time if we wanted to talk about games like kind of sandbox, like Minecraft, right? Being basically
Right.
just a system,
Yeah, I was thinking of the same thing.
less a game than just a system, a place for players to be able to make stuff up, to be able to generate their own content. Less than, hey, this is the way you play Minecraft. Like, no one ever says that. No one ever thinks about that. It's just a place where people can be incredibly creative, and that's the huge draw to it.
Right. Yeah, there's this tension between kind of rules and tools. Or I don't
Yeah,
actually
sure.
know if those are the right
Ooh, I like
categories,
that.
but
That's a
if you
decent.
just give the player tools and there aren't any rules and there's no sort of way to use no obvious way that they relate to the objective of the
Right,
game.
right,
Now, arguably, Minecraft doesn't have an objective,
right.
but if there's no clear way that how the tool helps you accomplish the objective of the game, then you are just kind of left with this sort of sandbox item
Yeah,
where it's like, well, this teleports my character, but I have no idea why that's useful.
right, right.
Um, where or if you have too many rules and there's not really any flexibility about what different things can do,
Hmm.
you end up with a game it's very straightforward. Basically,
Yeah,
there's not a lot of room for
exactly. Yeah.
creativity in terms of the actions that you take.
Hmm.
Again, something like chess, there's no one's going to watch a chess game and be wowed that you moved your knight in an L shape because
Right,
that's what
exactly.
knights do.
Yeah, yeah. Exactly. Yeah, yeah. There's no room to be like, oh my gosh, I never thought to use the knight that way. But it's like, no, that's the only way you can use the knight.
Right,
That's
and yet there is, and so I'm like hesitant to say that
yeah, I
because
know.
like
Yeah,
there,
I know what you
of
mean.
course, there are novel ways
Strategically,
to
right? Yeah,
night
yeah.
in like a broader sense, but not like in this really micro mechanical sense.
Yeah, no, totally, and that's that's another like kind of big. Our podcast is appropriately titled, Mark, because is another big meta concept, right? The idea of like, yeah, unstructured fun can be very difficult. Actually, like games thrive on rules. You need a very specific set of rules for a game to work. If you don't have, like
Right.
Calvin Ball from Calvin and Hobbes being like the opposite, which of course is a different type of fun, but like that if you ever have read the Calvin and Hobbes comics, whenever they play Calvin Ball, which has no rules, that comic always develops into them just arguing and hitting each other basically. Versus something that has, so rules are necessary for games, right? But I actually really liked the
Right.
rules and tools like spectrum you put out there. That even rhymes. That sounds like something straight out of a
Yeah.
sociology
That's how
textbook.
you know it's good. That's how
Yeah,
you know it's true.
that's
Yeah.
yeah, totally.
All important facets of reality rhyme
Yeah.
in English, just in English.
Yeah, and take with. There's one quote we could pick out from this is like, hey, if you have one takeaway from this, that all important facets of reality rhyme in English. Well, cool. I think that's perfect place to
Yeah,
cut
I
out. You
think so.
think?
All right, I'll see you later,
Sweet.
Greg. If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter at Gaming Mechanics or our Facebook page by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for joining us.